Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel. Last Sunday, I did a video about the development of the German trench systems on the Western Front in the First World War. And I said in that video then that I wasn't going to look at the trench in itself because that's a video on its own. So I thought today I would do that video on its own, all about the trench in the First World War. But first, a bit of background. Trenches as a military science have been with us for at least 2,000 years, but always in the field of siege warfare. A army would be inside a village or whatever, dig some trenches round to protect themselves. The besiegers would come up, dig some trenches around the outside of those, and basically a siege would take place. And it's only until you get to the mid-1860s that you find trenches are actually used in, for want of a better word, on a battlefield, on an open battlefield. And this is because after the Napoleonic Wars and during the mid-19th century, weaponry became more powerful, became longer ranged, and the defence began to overtake the offensive in terms of destructive power. And I'm going to read you a little quote here from O.E. Hunt, author of one of the books of the photographic history of the Civil War, which will basically tell you what I mean. So, hasty entrenchments, as they are known by soldiers, were first used largely in the American Civil War. Even at that time, General Sherman expressed his belief that earthworks, and especially field works, were destined to play a conspicuous part in all future wars, since they enabled a force to hold in check as a superior one for a time. Now, after the American Civil War, because that's basically what the American Civil War devolved into, a lot of trench warfare. After the American Civil War and leading up to the late 19th century, weapons became even more powerful. And when you get the development of fast-firing artillery and the machine gun in particular, the spectre of trench warfare was fully realised by European powers. And they drew up in the late years of the 19th century and leading up to the First World War, series of regulations, manuals that detailed how a modern war would be fought. And these included trench warfare. I've got a couple of examples here. This is the Field Service Regulations of 1909, and they do deal with trench warfare, but they still see it as part of siege operations. In 1914, you get the Field Service Pocket Book, which is issued, and this gives a diagram of basic trenches, how they were meant to be laid out. These basically are how trench warfare developed in 1914, the late 1914, with little shallow trenches. But what I'm going to show you is, get my whiteboard. So these regulations and these field regulations, service regulations, they laid out exactly what was required for trench warfare. They basically laid out the basics of a trench. Now what we've drawn up here is a basic cross-section of a trench that these regulations recommended. This is what they ordered. So this is just a basic layout of a trench showing all the features, and we'll go through the features now. So basically what you've got, you start to dig a hole out, quite a deep hole here, and the soil that comes out of your trench is used to build your parapet at the front of the trench. See, this one's lined with sandbags as well to make it even more bulletproof. All the soil went on the back of the trench where the parados is, usually higher than the parapet, for various reasons. One is that if a shell goes off behind your trench, then it's protecting you from the blast there. If a bullet comes across and goes across the top of your parapet, it's going to hit the parados and not go further back into other lines. So you've got your parapet and your parados. and then you've got the main body of the trench itself. You've got your interior slope, which is usually revetted. Revetments in trench warfare, especially in the First World War, there is no set way of doing this. You saw always, they were revetted in always. Wooden beams all on that in a face. You could put chicken wire up to hold that front face up. Wattle fencing type stuff to hold it. Corrugated sheets, anything to hold that interior slope upwards and protect it from falling into the trench. Down the bottom you've got the fire step. I mean, these trenches are, something like this is about 8 foot deep, so to fire over the top of the parapet you need a fire step, so you stand on that and fire over the top. But when you're walking down in the trench, you want to be below the surface of the trench, surface of the soil. So in the bottom here you've got what we call the sump. Now, trenches get wet, you get a lot of water in trenches, and the sump is to allow, it's like a drain basically, it's an open sewer or open drain to let the water run out, so you're not standing in the water all the time. And then you have duck boards on the top of that trench, so you're walking on wooden boards basically, and you're watering underneath you. And then of course you've got your rear slope revetted as well, the same as your forward slope. And then you've got your berm there, which is a bit of a separated gap between your parados. That really is a standard laid out regulation for a trench in the First World War. Didn't always look like this. This is the ideal. If you've got like on the Somme, if you've got chalk you're digging into, of course you've got a nice stable ground to dig in, and you could dig deep. In other places on the Western Front, like in Flanders, where the water table is really high, very difficult to dig down this far, so you would have to dig so far till you hit the water, and then you have to build up the rest of your trench and make it a breastwork with sandbags, so it was above the sort of the ground level. So that's the basic trench. That was the ideal trench for the First World War. That's how the regulations set it out. They did change over time. Trenches like this in 1915, 1916 are relatively deep and relatively narrow. The Germans, which we say the masters of trench warfare, realised after the Somme that narrow, deep trenches were death traps for soldiers. Because if this falls in, you get trapped in it. And if they had a dugout underneath here, then you could get trapped in it as well. And they went to wider trenches, not quite as deep, but wider. Basically, they said that the power of an English shell is in its destructive power rather than its explosive power for distance. So that's how they basically changed the form of the trench to match how they experienced Somme. And if we go to the top picture, this is sort of going back to what I said before in the previous video, where we looked at a trench system. So what we've basically got on here, and I'll pop it down there, we've basically drawn up a trench system. This is sort of reminiscent of the Somme, basically, when you've got 3 trenches. So you've got your fire trench at the front, you've got a support trench behind, a reserve trench, and these communication trenches between them, so you're not moving across ground to get there, you're going through a trench to get from one trench to the other, and dugouts. And you will notice, when I did my video last week, when I drew my trench, it was just a straight line. That was just an example of the system laid out. But you will notice that fire trenches were not straight. They zigzagged, they had fire bays. Reason for this was that if a shell lands here, if you had a straight trench, that explosive power would travel straight along the trench. If someone broke into a trench line here and you had a straight trench, they could just fire straight down the whole length of your trench. The fire base sort of broke all that up. Also, if you had some troops break into your trench here and you're here, you can hold them off. They have got to get round this fire bay. And there's an example in 1917 when the Australians attacked the Hindenburg line at Bullecourt, and they broke into the German trenches. They were fierce fights across these fire bays with hand grenades. because you had to basically, it broke up an enemy attack, and they had to fight their way from round bay to bay. And you can hold them up. If you're here, throw grenades over, you can hold up an attacking force. Stops you losing your trench straight away. And you can also then, if you're holding troops here, you can infiltrate around the back, down your communication trenches, get behind them. So yeah, a very complicated system, a trench. So yeah, not as simple as I showed the other week. It's a very complicated scientific way of fighting. Now, it is my contention, and I'd like comments on this, and anyone can comment on this on the video and tell me if I'm wrong, if I'm right, if I'm barking up the wrong tree. But my contention is that First World War trenches are a particularly unique 20th century phenomenon. When you look at trenches leading up to the First World War, leading up to the beginning of the 20th century, going back those 2,000 years, trenches are more earthworks. They're more thrown up. It's a shallow scrape in the ground, and then you throw the soil above to form a big parapet. But you're not digging right down like in a trench here. And if you see this photo of Civil War trenches, basically, this is Petersburg in 1865, you can see what I mean. They don't dig down that far, and they throw the soil up and form a large parapet. So you're just below the ground level, and the soil's thrown up. Then it's braced with timber, or wattle is what I'm calling about there, to protect it from incoming fire. Now, when I say trenches are unique, what do I mean? And why do I say that? Power of weapons in the late 19th century and the 20th century was of magnitudes much more powerful than what soldiers in the American Civil War were facing. So if you'd built your Western Front in the form of how the American Civil War did, was the actual power and velocity of these weapons, that breastwork would not be a protection against that incoming fire. The narrowness of no man's land, and you fire a rifle on one side of no man's land into a parapet on the other side, there's a good chance it's going to go through if it's built in the same sort of construction as just a mound of earth as a parapet. The only way to get out, and same with artillery, power of artillery blow your parapet apart, which is why in the First World War soldiers dug down below ground to protect themselves. The weapons were that powerful, they couldn't be sort of head and shoulders above with a earthen parapet in front of them. Even a thin sandbag wall wouldn't stop a bullet. And this is shown that when I talked about Neuve-Chapelle in 1915 last week, and then I talked about Aubers Ridge, between those two battles, because they were in Flanders, and the trenches there were built up, they were sandbag breastworks, because they couldn't dig down far. After Neuve-Chapelle and the British broke through, because the breastworks were destroyed, by the time the British attacked at Aubers Ridge in May, that breastwork had been increased dramatically. It was a massive wide breastwork, basically because they realised that the artillery could really blast their breastworks apart. So if you were above ground in a waterlogged area, you needed really wide breastworks to basically hold that fire from destroying your breastworks. But anywhere else you could, you dug deep. So like I say, that is my contention. That is why I say that First World War trench systems were unique, because leading up to First World War, trenches were shallow with a big parapet of a breastwork of earth thrown up. It's only in the First World War where you start to get them where they do dig deep so that people are actually right underground. Now, if you want to learn more about how trenches were built, how trenches were used in the First World War, there is a really good source. This came out in 1986, 24-Hour Trench by Andrew Robert Shaw. Basically, group of reenactors, very knowledgeable reenactors, and Andy Robshaw, historian. They built a trench system and lived in it. Now, it is a really good source. It's packed with photographs of that 24-hour trench and how trenches were constructed. So it's a really good source, and I don't say that just because Paul Harding, who does the videos on here as well, is featured in here. He actually took part in the production of this book. There's plenty of photographs of him here, but it is a good introductory book, detailed book of how trenches were operated by the British, at least the British, in the First World War. I recommend it, heartily recommend it. Whoops. Right, so I think that is just about covered everything. Like I say, I would like people to comment on my comments about trenches. That's how I feel about it. I hope it's given you a good insight now. So now you've had a video on the development of a trench system, and now you've got a video on a trench itself, very basically covered, because still trenches in the First World War it's a massive subject. But I hope that's given you a good insight. Please do like and subscribe. Paul will be back tomorrow with another video. So we will see you then. Bye.